In my previous video, I wondered and questioned the meaning of people spending more than 10 years attending schools and studying, only to forget all knowledge gained without acquiring any abilities to think and find answers independently, leading to idiotic superstitious ideas and ignorance in their own health, well-being, and quality of life. Instead of taking the initiative for their own health, well-being, and quality of life, they derogate themselves by submitting their own health, well-being, and quality of life to other people, the healthcare system, or worse still, questionable YouTubers, friends, or even strangers. All of these parties do not act for their best interest. It is very pathetic of those people to rely on something that they have no control on. If initiative or autonomy are some of the basic elements for freedom and dignity, they are not exercising and living their freedom and dignity. They are like pigs in the farm whose health is managed by the farmer. Maybe even worse than pigs, because if the farmer abandons them, they are doomed, while pigs can still go feral and thrive on their own. This prompts me to question whether education in society is really meaningful. Supposedly, education makes you smart, as people say. The question is whether this is true. Does education improve cognitive ability? Another well-established phenomenon is that higher education levels predict better health, lower mortality rates, and longer life expectancy. But whether higher education levels cause these is the question. It is known that families of higher socio-economic class provide better access to different resources so that people from these families can attain higher education level and at the same time access better healthcare, living and occupational environment, nutritious food, social connection, etc. This is known as socio-economic endowment. Basically, being endowed translates into easy mode life. This leads to lower stress, healthier lifestyle, fewer threats to survival, lower risk of diseases, and even though you get life-threatening diseases, you have better access to healthcare, expensive high-quality treatments, and even organ donation. All these, of course, contribute to better health and lower mortality. But education level here is just a result instead of the cause. On the other hand, of course, higher education levels may lead to a higher socio-economic class that offers you all those mentioned survival advantages later in life due to increased competitiveness in the job market and social resources. But I would consider all the effects of education level based on the competitiveness in society or the rat race as artificial, since these effects are expected to be eliminated when one's education level is not significantly higher than other people in society. For example, a century ago, almost no one held a university degree and secondary school level was already considered a high education level. These graduates, of course, enjoy the advantage in the job market and socio-economic advancement. However, now almost everyone graduates secondary school, so the same level of education no longer offers any advantages. This is referred to as academic inflation. If education level is purely a result, then of course it has no effects and is considered not meaningful. But if education level has artificial effects, I will call it relatively meaningful. And if it has absolute effects that do not change substantially across different social structures, it will be truly meaningful. I want to know whether education is meaningful in this sense. Different twin studies from the US, UK, Denmark, and China address whether education exerts effect instead of being a result of socio-economic endowments. More interestingly, because it compares the education levels of identical twins raised by the same family, other factors like genetics, parenting styles, childhood lifestyles, habits, diet, etc. are more controlled. The results of these studies show only weak to no effects of education on health outcomes, hospitalization, and mortality later in life. This suggests that education is not any major direct cause for better health and reduced mortality because with socioeconomic endowment, genetics, childhood lifestyles, and habits controlled, education does not significantly change hospitalization and mortality rates in later life. However, the sample characteristics and statistical methods in twin studies may limit the generalizability of the results to the general population, as well as statistical power. At least it is safe to say that compared to genetics, family and socio-economic endowment, education is at most a small factor to health and mortality. If anything, two of the twin studies suggest education leads to better mental health, less smoking, and less overweight. So it is still possible that education modifies later lifestyles to make the person healthier to reduce their mortality. This mechanism clearly depends on social structure. For example, if smoking was widely prohibited and physical activities were highly incentivized, we would expect that people would not be exposed to any active or passive smoking, but do exercise regularly. People would be healthier and the mortality rate dropped. Whether education could make people live like this doesn't matter in this society, as other factors or policies had already ensured people to live like this. Imagine that there were no so-called good or bad neighborhoods in this society too. People in this society lived equally and were exposed to the same level of hazards, threats, or risks. Education, therefore, could not possibly affect individuals living in environments that may contribute to health. Together with the competitiveness point mentioned earlier, all these suggest that education is at most relatively meaningful. To me, this becomes very interesting because this suggests that the presence of the effect of education reflects the inequality in society. If a society ensured all people live equally healthily, education might have no role in health and mortality at all. If education reduces mortality by promoting healthy lifestyle, the mortality from diseases contributed by unhealthy lifestyle should be the most correlated with education level. Indeed, a recent study from Japan shows that in both sexes, mortality from cerebrovascular diseases, ischemic heart diseases, and lung cancer is the most correlated with education than other mortality causes, given that these diseases are all well known to be preventable by healthy lifestyles. Similar study from the US also show that mortality causes of low preventability are much less predicted by education. Interestingly, studies consistently show that education positively correlates with mortality from breast cancer, whose risk factors include no birth history, delayed age at childbearing, and less breastfeeding, which are all associated with higher education levels. And it is known that women enrolled in education are much less likely to have a new baby, possibly because they are focusing on the education and can't spare resources for childbearing and raising at that time. These suggest a possibility that education reduces mortality by promoting a healthy lifestyle. Besides, it is well known that education can grant access to jobs of higher socio-economic classes. After all, professional jobs which pay more and grant higher job satisfaction require professional education. So for this mechanism, the working model is that education improves socio-economic status, which in turn provides better access to different resources for well-being to improve health and reduce mortality. This one is just a rat race and easy to understand, but the former pathway that education promotes a healthy lifestyle may not be that straightforward. Studies show high school as a critical point for the effect of education, which is not as strong in tertiary education. Therefore, I am focusing on high school education at this moment. Here, I want inputs from the audience. Please let me know if you think you have ever obtained any health advice from your teachers or peers during your primary and secondary education. I'm not so sure. At least, I don't think the curriculum emphasizes health education. However, at school as a social circle, people talk, and those common sense health advice like do not smoke, exercise regularly, keep fit, do not be fat, etc. spread. Moreover, schools provide physical education and have rules to more or less force you to exercise and not to smoke, and then hopefully you develop this awareness and healthier habits. It also wastes your time and energy so that you can't afford loitering around and essentially shields you from violence, drugs, and crimes. In addition, my experience is that when I was at school, I slept and woke up much more regularly than what I am doing now. So yes, schools also enforce a regular sleep-wake cycle or so-called good sleep hygiene to me. And schooling gave me a reason to go out and walk, so schooling also forced me to increase my physical activity. Some studies also suggest the social network gained from schools is beneficial for health and longevity. If education or schooling really works this way, it is mainly a social effect which exposes you to healthy information and social networks, but shields you from different harms. And now I suddenly realize that this exactly agrees with one common objective of schooling: to promote holistic and healthy development of youngsters. Apparently, education is doing what it is supposed to do. Although the effects may actually be small and arguably replaceable, as long as you have access to other good social circles, but if it's free and compulsory, it is an easily available tool. Now, I'm convinced that education may act as a sanatorium or incubator to provide opportunities and information for healthy practice, and it is relatively meaningful to health and longevity. Interestingly, studies support that academic pressure from schooling contributes to students' mental health problems and depression. However, academic expectation, on the other hand, offers a protective effect against adulthood depression, which occurs later in life. As academic pressure and expectation are closely related, this suggests a complex interaction between pressure and expectation, and that generally higher educational expectation is associated with higher education attainment, which offers a protective effect against mental health problems. After all, if you think education is a social resource, then it makes perfect sense that it can deliver both social resources and social pressure. Another popular belief is that education makes people smart. By smart here, I will define it in terms of performance, especially the cognitive one. Another concept is general intelligence. It is commonly believed that performance is task-specific, and the transferability of performance between tasks is rather limited. For example, simply improving memory does not directly translate to the betterment of verbal ability or reading comprehension. Similarly, chess and music training do not necessarily improve your academic performance. On the other hand, general intelligence is believed to facilitate transferability, since part of the intelligence, called fluid intelligence, involves the ability to learn new things or solve new problems. Therefore, there are at least two questions of interest here. 1. Does education improve task-specific performance? And 2. Does education improve intelligence or cognitive ability in general? And if education does, I may possibly call it truly meaningful in this sense, as long as this effect is largely independent of the social structure. For example, these effects are not mediated by competition in society. Though you may argue about the access to quality education, or if a future society has some other methods to boost intelligence to the extent that education is no longer as useful, it will at most be relatively meaningful. If you have any thoughts here, please leave a comment. Okay, question 1. Does education improve task-specific performance? This may seem a bit too obvious, as this is the whole point of training. For example, professional training prepares you for professional jobs. Learning algebra at school makes you know how to do algebra. Usually, studies on transferability use this well-established phenomenon as a positive control to contrast transferability. If the only finding is the improvement in task-specific performance, this means no transferability. For question 2, does education improve cognitive ability in general? The studies suggesting no or limited transferability may be discouraging. However, those studies usually only implement a short-term program to study the effects. Education, however, is long-term. Encouragingly, chess extracurricular activity for 1 year was found to offer transferability to cognitive ability and problem-solving skills. This reminds me that schools and the education system as an incubator not only provides curriculum, but also extracurricular activities. Another interesting study shows that 4.5-year post-secondary education improves general intelligence measured by IQ in intellectually disabled adults. Anyway, more directly, the current research points to the notion that education actually improves cognitive ability in general, not only crystallized intelligence such as skills, experience, and knowledge, but also fluid intelligence such as pattern recognition, processing speed, memory, and reasoning. This means that even though the programs or subjects taught by the education system may not make sense to most of the students, as students often complain why they need to learn this and that, why they need to learn algebra or history or chemistry, etc. An explanation is that different subjects or tasks demand or train different general cognitive functions. Although transferability is still very limited for short-term programs, given enough time, education may slowly train the students to be more intelligent. More importantly, years of education and education level are found to be positively correlated with cognitive ability later in life and lower the risk of dementia. This raises a lot of questions on why and how. As dementia is a result of age-related decline of cognitive ability before the decline acts as a reserve. If education leads to higher cognitive ability before the decline, it is protective against dementia. The question is how the effect of education on the increase in cognitive ability sustains that long after graduation. This carryover effect likely involves factors in the relatively meaningful sense. As cognitive ability is a function of health, all the mechanisms mentioned earlier regarding the effects of education on health apply. More specifically, the gravitational hypothesis states that people with higher education level choose more cognitively challenging lifestyles, including jobs and hobbies. That is, they gravitate factors forming a more enriched or cognitively stimulating living environment. Interestingly, studies found that highly educated people who are not engaged in cognitively stimulating jobs are not protected from dementia, suggesting that their cognitive reserve can't be maintained. In addition, these studies point to the agreement that the cognitive reserve gained from education is maintained through active selection of living environment. People need to keep their living environment stimulating enough to stay intelligent. Consistently, according to some studies from societies that prevent certain highly educated people from getting a cognitively stimulating job, their cognitive reserve is less maintained. So, for short-term, education may be truly meaningful to smartness and intelligence, but for long-term, it is again relatively meaningful. I am skeptical and even cynical at times, but to my surprise, this time I successfully convinced myself with current evidence that education is meaningful in terms of health and intelligence. Personally, I also think education is beneficial to me. Well, to begin with, I just like to study. And I was always treating exams as either assessments to check how well I was learning or simply as a game. Also, different subjects offer me different perspectives to understand and appreciate the world. Based on more knowledge and understanding, I can discover more interesting things in the world, enjoy a wide range of activities, solve real-life problems, and make better decisions. Languages, mathematics, and sciences are all very useful. And later I even realized that history in secondary education offers a theoretical framework for me to understand the evolution of the world, art, politics, literature, and philosophy. Well, of course, science history is also very interesting. Tertiary education further developed my skills and knowledge in biomedical sciences, critical inquiry of knowledge, and lifelong learning. Of course, it also enables me to develop a useful skill set for the job markets in many countries around the world, so that I can move to and live in almost any countries I like. Although what I have been talking about implies education equals schooling, as I am actively learning different things constantly, I think I'm still under education, but not schooling. One interesting phenomenon, though maybe anecdotal, was depicted in one of my favorite anime called Punilu's Line. An episode portrays that a robot character was forced to learn a subject. She did not enjoy this forced, spoon-fed education, but eventually she developed an interest in the subject and continued to pursue this subject later. As mentioned before, education exposes people to different stimuli. Through this experience, people learn about things, the world, and themselves, and then hopefully find what they like and enjoy in life. Finally, although I agree that education is meaningful, my criticism of people spending more than 10 years attending schools only to forget all the knowledge gained from schooling without acquiring any abilities to think and find answers independently still holds. Arguably, this criticism only becomes more substantial after realizing what education does and is supposed to do. Of course, I acknowledge that without schooling, those people would probably be more pathetic. Well, anyway, I made the criticism probably just because I was very disappointed by those people. I think they were not fully utilizing, realizing, and enjoying the resource